One of the biggest mistakes that I often see other developers make is forgetting about authorization or not really knowing how to deal with it. In fact, if we take a look at the top 10 web application security risks, we can see that broken access control was actually at the top. So this is a big problem, and I can't really blame developers because it is a little bit tricky. There is RBAC and there is ABAC. There are all these different strategies for implementing permissions. So in this video, I'll explain what you need to know about authorization, including something called RBAC and ABAC and what are these different permission systems, and also how to practically implement them. So for example, if we have a blog or some kind of content management system, I can currently view the posts, but I also have these buttons for updating a post and deleting a post. But you can imagine that not everyone should get these buttons. So this is the realm of authorization Authz, which is different from authentication, right? Authentication basically will just give you a user object, right? So the user may have an email, right? They may have a name. It's just proving who they are. It doesn't mean that they suddenly should be able to update posts or delete posts. So typically after the authentication step, you have an authorization step. So here we need to decide if the user is even allowed to update posts. Now you may think, oh, I'm just going to check if user.role, right? Maybe they have a role. If they're an admin, we'll set it to true, and by default we want to be careful, so by default we will actually set it to false, right? So typically I see this all the time, it's admin and not admin. And then of course we only want to render that update button, they are allowed to do so. So you can see when I save here, it disappears actually because the user doesn't even have any role right now. And we could add the role to the user object if we want. So we can actually make this user an admin. So if I save it, you can see we do get the button back. But this is actually also not really what we want to do. For example, what if we have other roles as well, like editor role, right? If in a blog we have editors, right? So if the user is admin or editor, but maybe only posts that are in draft mode can be edited. So now we also need some information about the post, right? So we can do something like post status is draft. And now actually we find out not every editor can edit posts, only senior editors, right? So now the user.experience level needs to be senior, right? Just as an example here, you can see how messy this is getting. I'm probably already making mistake because this is very quickly going to grow into a big ball of spaghetti code that makes it almost impossible for us to robustly implement permission, right? We want to build robust websites and web apps. So we need something that is better structured than this. You can imagine that we have other places in our app where we also need this type of logic. So then are you just going to copy this and paste that in some other place? What if you need to change something? Maybe you can only edit posts if they are archived. Now I would have to update that in every place where I use this type of logic. So a better way would be to centralize this authorization logic somewhere. So what I could do is create an Authz file, let's say. So and then in this file, we want to have a so-called policy. Basically have the rules, the permission rules here in one file. Now to set up a policy like that, there are different ways of doing it. So there's RBAC, there's ABAC. So RBAC is typically where you would start. So this is very focused around roles. So you can imagine that we have a viewer role. A viewer can view posts. We may also have an editor role in our blog or content system, and an editor can view but also create and edit posts. And then an admin typically, also a role, can typically do everything, right? They can also delete posts. So with RBAC, it's very focused around roles. So you have admin as a role. So then we have actions, which is, well, what you can do on a particular resource, right? So you always have a role that can do something on a particular resource. So how could we implement something like that here? Well, we could come up with something ourselves. So we can perhaps create a permissions object here, and we can have one array here for each role. So there's a viewer role. What can the viewer do? Well, they have an action, colon, and then the resource. This is typically how you work with this in code. So you have the action, colon, and then the resource. An editor has some more permissions. So they can also create a post and edit a post. And an admin, even more, right? They can also delete posts, okay? Then we can create a helper function. Typically you want to have a function where you can just pass in the user, the action they want to take on what specific resource. And then the function will just return true or false. This function will just take that information, return true or false. So it will just essentially check if the user has the required permission to do so, right? So then we can use that function. Well, let's actually see, to replace all of that spaghetti code, right? In this case, we actually also have something called attributes. We'll talk about it in a second. But what you would do is typically just invoke one function here, check permission, and I'm just going to pass along the user, what action they want to take, in this case edit, and on what resource, right, post in this case. So you can see this is already much cleaner. You can see this user can indeed edit posts, right? So we still have the well, actually I'm calling it update here, but it's the same as editing. I can also have a role of a viewer, right? Just a viewer. And you can see then the editing button disappears. We can do the same for the delete posts. We can actually even write it in one line, right? We can just call the function in there, right? So for deleting posts, we can just reuse that function. You pass in the user, the action they want to take, on what resource. And then we will just get a result here that we can work with, right? So here we can then do some conditional rendering. You can see a basic user, a viewer, cannot edit or delete. But if we make this user an admin, this user can suddenly do everything. So now if I need to make a change, you know what? Editors can also delete posts. I only have to go in here and I just add it right here, delete post. And now wherever I'm using this function in my code, it would automatically be updated, right? So this is a better structure, I would argue. So this is a very solid structure where you have authentication. Maybe you're doing that yourself. You're not using a third party. Maybe you have your own authentication system, but maybe you are using a third party. So my channel is sponsored by Kind. I like using Kind, but all of these authentication providers essentially just give you a user object, basically some information about the user. And that is not sufficient. So then you have a second step, the authorization step, where you need to check the exact level of access that the user should have access to, right? Really access control. Honestly, the authentication step is usually the easier step. It's the authorization step that I would say is where the fun really begins. All right, now the downside of what we're doing here is that this is still sort of hard-coded in our own code. So if we need to make a change, right? So if I do want to allow editors to delete posts, changed my app code, now I have to deploy again. So my app now needs to be built and go through the deployment pipeline. Also, what if you have other people on your team, like a manager, let's say, that also wants to change permissions? Also, this is still a simple RBAC type of setup. Once it gets more complex, especially when we start talking about ABAC, this will also become very complex to deal with. So is there perhaps a better way? So I actually think yes, Permit has a really nice solution. They are today's sponsor and they make it much, much easier to deal with permissions. So let me quickly show you how we can achieve the same as what we were doing before, but much easier here in the UI, here in the Permit dashboard. In Permit, I can also create a policy, right? So we were doing it in our code ourselves before, but I can actually also much easier actually just do it here in the dashboard. So let's do RBAC in Permit. So remember, it's about a role that can take some actions on some resource, right? So let's actually create a resource. We will create a resource here for post and we'll call it post. What type of actions can people take on this? Well, they can view, let's call it read, create, update, delete. All right, that sounds good to me. We'll talk about ABAC and actually also ReBAC in a second. We are just doing RBAC now. So that's the resource. Okay, so that's step one, you could say. We also have roles here. By default, actually, Permit will create some basic roles. So actually, they create an admin role, an editor role, and a viewer role, right? So now we also have roles. So we have resources and roles. And the actions we also have actually. So now we can create an actual policy. So if we go to the policy editor, you can see we can actually just check mark the actions that this particular role should be able to take on that resource. So an admin should be able to do all of this on the post resource. An editor should be able to do everything except delete on posts, right? And a viewer, well, should only be able to read posts. Cool, so now we have our policy basically for authorization. How do I know I use it in my code? Well, here I can go to connect. I'm actually using Next.js, so we are just using Node.js, but you can see they have all these other options as well. So they have a Permit.io SDK. Let me quickly install this. Okay. All right. So then here, if we scroll down a little bit, we can set Permit up like this. So they will give you an API key. Don't show it to anybody else. I will delete it after recording the video. So I will actually delete our own policy file. So I will delete that and I will create a new file here. I will import Permit right here and we will just export Permit so we can then use that. All right, so now I can use this Permit variable. So if I go back here, we will not have that check permission from a utility function from our own code. We will have Permit. And Permit has a check method on here. All right, now to make this work, we are not going past the whole user object. We only pass a unique identifier for Permit. We're only going to pass a unique identifier. So we could use an ID, right? So typically the user object will have some ID. Now I will actually use the email here. So the email will also be unique here. And we do need to await this. So it will make a network call actually to Permit. So now what we're doing is, hey Permit, here is some user. They want to perform some action on this resource, you deal with all the logic and rules that we actually set up in the dashboard, and you just give us a result here. And so from our app, we're just going to send over the user ID or some identifier, what action they want to take on what particular resource. Permit will run that policy logic and it will return true or false. Now, if you're worried about latency, if you're just testing out Permit, they will actually host this in the cloud. And so we are making a network call. And so there may be some latency, but this is just for trying it out essentially. The idea is that you would run Permit in a container, in a, let's say, Docker container as part of your own environment. So then this call to Permit would be nearly instant, right? So this would not be a latency problem in that case. So here we are passing john@gmail.com, but Permit doesn't know about john@gmail.com yet. So we do need to synchronize our user with Permit here as well. So if we go to directory here, Permit is not aware of any users yet. So I do have to add a user here. So here we need some unique identifier for that user, right? So here I'm actually using their email, but if you have some auth provider, they will give you an ID. So here I'm adding John, and John, let's make John an admin. Okay, John is an admin. So if I save here, all right, so now we have our user. So now when we send over that user, Permit will know about the users. So you need to synchronize your users with Permit. So as an example, they have the sync user method that you can pass, and then Permit is aware of your user. So for example, if I'm using Kind will actually have webhooks. So when a user signs up, they will send me a webhook. So then in that webhook, I can call sync user to automatically synchronize my users with Permit as well. Of course, if you have some small internal application, you can do it manually here as well. So now if I refresh here, we actually see a delete button. So clearly Permit has decided that John can delete posts, but we don't see update posts here because I'm calling it edit, but actually in the dashboard we call it update. So if I change this to update, you can see now we also get the update post button back again. Now we still have a role here, but now we have already specified the role in Permit, right? So we are not passing the role to the user. So now we are centralizing all of this logic here in Permit. The main benefits in my view are that, first of all, we can set everything up in a UI instead of hard coding it in code. But if we have other people on our team that also need to change these permissions, it's much easier for them. A lot of the people that you work with, they may not be comfortable with code. They don't want to change anything in code, but they would be comfortable here in a UI dashboard. Also, if we now make a change, right? So now let's actually change John, not an admin. Well, let's actually make John an editor. So editors should not be able to delete posts, right? So now if I save it, I changed it here in the dashboard. I don't have to redeploy my app or anything. I can actually just refresh here and you can see my app is automatically using the latest up-to-date, right? So it's very nice to decouple that from our app actually. So they also give you an audit log so you can actually see what happened. So it will show me, for example, hey, there was an attempt here by this user to delete a post and this was the decision, it's permitted, okay? So what we just did is RBAC, role-based access control. And that is typically where you would start. But over time, you need more nuance. You need more fine-grained control, essentially. And so a lot of organizations tend to grow towards an attribute-based access control system. So you can imagine that, well, we still have an editor, right? So an editor can edit posts. But now we have a bunch of qualifiers, essentially, right? So not every editor can edit posts, only senior editors, right? So this senior is an attribute for that editor. So we still have you could say a role, right? An editor role. They still have this action edit, and we still have our posts resource, but we just have a bunch of qualifiers here. So another one here is posts. Not every post can be edited, only posts that are in draft mode, right? So that they have a status of draft, right? So this is also an attribute here for the posts resource. And what is also very common is that you have more like environmental attributes. So for example, the time or the location. So editors can only edit posts between Monday and Friday, right? We don't want to allow perhaps editing posts on the weekend. And location, I didn't add it here, but location is actually also very common. Maybe we only want to allow editing posts in the city where we have an office, let's say, right? So you can see that this is much more realistic. And these attributes give us the power to become much more nuanced, we get much more fine-grained control over the RBAC system, right? So let's actually try implementing this as well. So let's actually take a look at admins, right? So we have an admin, and previously we just had an admin can delete posts, period. Now let's actually try ABAC as well. So we will still just have an admin, so simple role can delete, right? So we still have an action, posts, so this is still the resource, but now we have a qualifier, only one for the resource. right? So only posts that are in archived mode can be deleted. So not every post, only those with a status of archive. So how would we go about doing that here in permit? It's actually very straightforward, right? So we still have our roles and we still have our posts resource, but now we want to add some ABAC rules, right? So actually first I need to specify for this resource for posts that they now can also have attributes. So a post can also have an attribute, in this case, status, right? It can be in draft mode, live, or archived, right? So here I'm only gonna add status here. If I save here, let's see. Okay, so now we told permit, hey, posts can also have some status. So the way it works now, I need to go to ABAC rules. I need to tell permit how to group those posts. So we will have posts in draft mode, posts in archived mode. Permit right now only knows that it can have a status, but it doesn't know what status yet. So we have all the posts, but we are essentially creating a subset of that, right? So the posts that are going to be in archived mode. So here we will tell permit, hey, there is a condition here for posts. If the status of that post equals archived, that those posts should be in their own group, essentially. They're special. That's a safe condition. This looks a bit complicated, but now the benefit is if I go to the policy editor, suddenly here we have a new column here for posts, but specifically for posts that are archived, right? So that have a status of archived. So now we can determine what we want to allow. So we want to allow admin users delete, and we still have delete here as well, but this is for all posts, right? This is for the subset of posts that are archived. So here we actually should remove it. So we don't want to allow deleting all posts, right? Only if they are archived, right? So only if they belong to the subset of archived posts. That's essentially what I just set up. An admin should still be able to create, read, update for all the posts. That's fine. We can keep it like that. The other roles, well, they can stay the same for now. They can stay the same. Okay, so now if I save here. All right, so now if I want to use ABAC, I actually do need to self-host permits, right? So now it will not work with their cloud decision point, right? So this is called a policy decision point. So this is the place where the actual true or false decision is made. It's going to run all of those authorization rules. If you're just trying it out, it's actually very convenient that they run it in the cloud for you, so you don't have to run a Docker container. That's what we've been doing. So, all right, so now if I want to use ABAC, I actually do need to self-host permits, right? So now it will not work with their cloud decision point. So I will run a Docker container locally to make these policy decisions. They very easily show it here as well. So here, if we want to enforce ABAC here, they have a Docker image that we can pull. Now, if you don't know anything about Docker or you haven't installed it yet, that's okay. If you do want to try it, you can download the Docker desktop here on the Docker website. It's actually very straightforward. You don't need to know much about Docker to be productive with it. So I have already installed it. So then you get an app called Docker Desktop. I have some other things running here because I've been using it. All right, so now we need to run a container so that we will actually run that policy decision point locally on our own computer. So I will open up my terminal app and I will paste this right here. All right, so the first time it may not have that Docker image as it's called. So it may download the Docker image, but when it has the Docker image, it's going to run an instance of it. All right, so now this looks good. So now if I go to containers, I can see indeed there is something running here with permit. So basically that decision point is now running locally on my own computer. So previously we were connecting to permit on their server, right? But now it's running on our own computer. So the URL will now be localhost port 7766. So now we're still going to pass the same information, right? So we essentially added an attribute for admins to delete posts. So we will still pass the user information. So permit knows who this user is, what action they want to take. And now we added an attribute to this post resource. So here now actually we will make it an object and we will say what type. This is the post type. And we need to specify the attributes for that. So this post would typically come from our database and it will have some status. It could be in a draft status. So now if I save here, if I refresh here, we don't see a delete button. Now let's actually make sure the user is actually an admin. So you can see the user was still an editor. Let's actually change this. So the user needs to be an admin. Let's make this user an admin. So an admin can delete posts. So let's see if that still works. When I refresh, we do not see a delete button because we are saying that this is going to be this resource, because we are saying this resource, this post is in draft mode, right? But we said only posts that are archived can be deleted. So if I save here, we get our deleted post back. It's really slick, by the way, that if you make an update here, the locally running permit decision point is automatically updated for that as well. It's actually really helpful. Right, so you would get your user object from your authentication provider. You pass along some unique identifier. You tell permit what action we are checking for, and then the resource. So here I'm sort of hard coding an object here. You can imagine that we would actually get a post from our database and we would grab its status. So we can make this more dynamic. All right, so now we saw RBAC, ABAC. There's also something called ReBAC, which is more centered around relationship typically, or hierarchies. The way I think about it is, for example, you can have a viewer with some active subscription can view posts on mobile, let's say. Now, if you have another user that is a family member of that viewer, maybe they automatically inherit the same permissions. So you can imagine Netflix, you typically can share the account with other members of your household, right? So then you get more into a relationship or even hierarchy type of situation, and maybe ReBAC can be more convenient in that case, right? So typically you would begin with some kind of RBAC system, and over time you kind of grow into one of these other systems. I would say ABAC is probably more common. I've actually really enjoyed working with permits. They also have UI elements. So if you want to allow your admin users, for example, assign roles, invite people, you can get like a UI element here. You can set it up. You can configure things on the left side, and this is what you would get inside your app. So then that admin user could say, hey, I want to invite Bob. And Bob needs to become an editor, right? Then we could send an email, let's say, to Bob, right? So I actually really enjoyed working with permits. It actually makes authorization with pretty complex logic very ergonomic to implement. In any case, hopefully this was helpful. I want to thank Permit for sponsoring this video. Definitely make sure to check them out. You can find a link in the description. And thank you for watching. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.